Welcome to History Distilled. Today we're going to look at the Battle of White Marsh. Time is short, let's jump into it. The year 1777 was drawing to a close in the cold Pennsylvania mist. It had been a year of long marches, brutal fighting, a year that saw the dream of independence flicker and fade, but never quite go out. In Philadelphia, the grand prize of the campaign, British General Sir William Howe and his army of redcoats and Hessians sat as conquerors. They held the rebel capital, the meeting place of the Continental Congress, the symbolic heart of the American Revolution. And yet, it was a hollow and uneasy victory. Just 13 miles to the northwest, General George Washington's Continental Army was encamped. They were beaten at Brandywine, repulsed to Germantown, but they still maintained a constant menacing presence. A no-man's land developed between the Army's camp and Philadelphia. It hosted daily violence of ambushes, skirmishes, lightning-fast cavalry raids between the two armies. It was a true petite guerre that bled both sides. For Howe, winter was approaching. He had one last chance to achieve his true objective before the snows of winter locked both sides into place. Find and destroy Washington's army in a single, decisive battle. For Washington, the objective was much more simple: survive. Fortunately for the Continental Army, something crucial was happening. They were hardening. The bloody scraps at Brandywine and Germantown had proven that they could stand toe-to-toe with British regulars. And in their commander, they had a leader whose true genius was not in winning battles, but in refusing to lose the war. Washington faced an intense storm of criticism from a frustrated Congress for his inability to defend Philadelphia. And yet, he demonstrated incredible resilience. He held his army together through defeat. He managed the complex logistics of supply. And most importantly, he maintained his troops' morale in the face of great hardship. Even so, Washington and his generals knew they needed to change their strategy. So they called a council of war. An attack on the now heavily fortified Philadelphia was quickly ruled out as suicidal. Instead, Washington chose to fight on the ground of his own choosing. So on November 2nd, the Continental Army marched to a new position at White Marsh. The site was a natural fortress. The Army's camp was spread across a range of high, densely wooded hills: Militia Hill, Fort Hill, Camp Hill. These hills commanded views of all the major roads leading north from Philadelphia. This was not merely a good defensive position, but one designed to exploit General Howe's great weakness. Howe was known to be a cautious commander, often hesitant to press an advantage. It was a caution born of trauma. You see, at the Battle of Bunker Hill in 1775, Howe had personally led his men in a frontal assault against the entrenched American militia. The British took the hill, but at a catastrophic cost. Waves of his finest troops were cut down. And it was the memory of that slaughter that haunted him, left him with a deep aversion to attacking fortified heights. Washington, having been defeated by British maneuver in the open fields of Brandywine and Germantown, now presented Howe with his nightmare scenario. For a month, the Continental Army dug in. Using picks and shovels, the soldiers transformed the hills into a formidable fortress, constructing earthen redoubts for artillery, digging trenches, creating dense barriers of abetus, felled trees with their branches sharpened and pointed toward the enemy. Washington was daring Howe. If he wanted that final battle, he had to come and get it. Washington was trying to bait Howe into another Bunker Hill. Another lesson Washington learned from Brandywine was the need for a much larger intelligence network. And so he established a sophisticated and effective network of spies operating in and around British-occupied Philadelphia. This network was Washington's eyes and ears, feeding him a constant stream of information on British plans, troop strength, morale. In the first days of December, this professional spy ring began sending urgent warnings to headquarters. The British were preparing a major offensive. But the most crucial piece of intelligence would come from a single, unlikely source: a Quaker woman named Lydia Darragh. Quakers, being a peaceful order, were officially neutral in the war, but the Darragh family secretly supported the American cause. You see, their eldest son was an officer serving with Washington. By a twist of fate, the Darrah house in Philadelphia was located directly across the street from General Howe's headquarters. And the British officers, finding the location convenient, had commandeered a large room in their home for high-level staff meetings. Thus, on the night of December 2nd in 1777, the British adjutant general informed Lydia that he and other officers would require the room for a secret council of war that would last late into the night. He gave her strict orders, ensure that everyone in the household was in bed and asleep at an early hour. A sense of unease filled Lydia. She ushered her family to their rooms, let the British officers in, and then retired to her own bed. But she didn't undress. Lying in the dark, her apprehension grew until it became unbearable. Slipping off her shoes, she crept silently down the hall to the meeting room. She pressed her ear to the keyhole. At first, she heard only muffled conversation, and then silence. Then, a single voice began to read an order aloud. It was the British attack plan. On the night of December 4th, the British Army would march out of Philadelphia in full force and launch a massive surprise attack on Washington's unsuspecting army at White Marsh. Lydia, her heart racing, retreated back to her room. She feigned sleep when the officers knocked on her door to be let out. The next morning, though, she devised a plan. Announcing that the household was out of flour, she told her husband that she must go several miles outside the city to the mill in Frankfort. It was a plausible excuse, so she went to General Howe's headquarters and obtained a written pass to cross the British lines. She walked for miles through the snow with her flour bag, that bag being her alibi. After leaving her bag at the mill, she pressed on toward the American lines. There she encountered an American cavalry patrol. The vital message of the planned English attack was delivered. Lydia returned home with her bag of flour. But the intelligence provided by Lydia Darragh and Washington's wider network was the decisive factor in the coming engagement. The warning of an incoming attack sped from the outpost to Washington's headquarters at the Emlyn House. Howe's entire strategy was dependent upon the element of surprise. A sudden, overwhelming attack on a sleeping camp could have shattered the Continental Army. But that weapon of surprise was now gone. Before we jump into the battle, if you're enjoying this video, please consider subscribing so you can be notified of future episodes. Now, let's get to the battle. Just after midnight on the brutally cold night of December 4th, the British Army began to move. Nearly 14,000 men marched silently out of Philadelphia in two great columns. Their objective, to crush the Continental Army in its sleep. The advance column, led by the formidable Lord Cornwallis, moved up the Germantown pike. But the Americans weren't sleeping. They were waiting. First contact came in pitch-black darkness. A vanguard of British light infantry stumbled upon an American cavalry patrol led by Captain Alan McLean. A brief, sharp firefight erupted. McLean's men fell back, and a rider was immediately dispatched to Washington's headquarters with the news. The British are here. By 3 a.m., the main British force had reached Chestnut Hill, a ridge just south of the American lines. There they halted, waiting for the gray light of dawn to illuminate their target. But the Americans needed no light. Suddenly, the boom of alarm cannons echoed across the hills, a signal that the entire Continental Army was awake and on high alert. As the sun rose, Washington sought to discover the enemy's strength and intentions. He ordered a force of 600 Pennsylvania militiamen under Brigadier General James Irvine to advance and skirmish with the British vanguard. Irvine's men moved forward and encountered the elite British light infantry. The Pennsylvanians got off the first volley, but they were no match for the disciplined professionals. The militia line quickly evaporated and fled in disorder. In the chaotic retreat, General Irvine tried desperately to rally his men. In the process, he was shot, fell from his horse, hand mangled, eventually being captured by the advancing British. The American right flank had been pushed back. But this was just a probe. The main American line, dug in on high ground behind them, remained untouched. From his vantage point on Chestnut Hill, General Howe surveyed the American positions through his spyglass. What he saw gave him pause. He saw the formidable lines of abetas. He saw the earthen redoubts and the muzzles of American artillery pieces covering every approach. The memory of the bloody slopes of Bunker Hill surely flashed through his mind as he surveyed these defenses. Because he would not order a frontal assault. Instead, he brought up his own cannons, but their shots fell short of the American lines. And thus, the first day of the battle ended in a stalemate. The British made their camp on Chestnut Hill, their plan for a surprise attack completely thwarted. The second day dawned with the two armies, nearly 25,000 men in total, facing each other across the frosty Wissahickon Valley, separated by a mere mile of ground. This ground became the game board, where a deadly chess match would be played out on the Pennsylvania landscape. Howe shifted his troops back and forth, probing for signs of weakness in the American line, hoping to tempt Washington into abandoning his fortress and fighting a battle in the open. But Washington refused the bait. He held the high ground, the stronger position. His task was not to defeat Howe, but to prevent Howe from defeating him. From behind his fortifications, he ordered his troops to shadow every British feint, shifting his men to counter every potential threat, but never committing his main force. Washington's strategy was one of supreme patience and discipline. As the day wore on with no advantage gained, the frustration within the British ranks boiled over. British and Hessian troops took their anger out on the local population, setting fire to the houses and farms of suspected patriots in the nearby villages of Kresheim and Beggarstown. Johann Ewald, a German Jaeger officer, later wrote of the horrible scene. The night was very dark. The blazing flames spread about with all swiftness, and the wind blew violently. The cries of human voices of the young and old, who had seen their belongings consumed by the flames without saving anything. But by the end of the day, Howe realized that Washington would not be drawn out. His probes of the American right line had failed. He decided on a new plan, one that had already worked twice against Washington. Under the cover of darkness, he would shift his entire army and attempt to turn Washington's left flank. Sometime after 1 a.m, the British army broke camp. They marched away from Chestnut Hill, their movements hidden by the terrain, swinging east in a wide arc. Their new target was the American left flank, anchored near a ridge known as Edge Hill. Washington did not learn of the maneuver until 8 a.m., but his reaction was swift and decisive. He would not be snookered a third time. He knew exactly who to send to meet this new threat. The legendary Colonel Daniel Morgan, a man who led a corps of riflemen and sharpshooters from the Virginia frontier. Morgan's men were not your typical soldiers. They were hunters, woodsmen, experts in the brutal, irregular warfare of the forest. These men, with support from the Maryland militia, represented Washington's finest light troops, and they moved quickly to intercept the British advance. These two forces collided in the dense woods near Edge Hill. What followed was not the linear, volley-fire battle of typical European warfare. No, it was a savage, swirling fight for pure survival. Using trees and rocks for cover, Morgan's riflemen unleashed deadly accurate fire on the advancing British columns. The woods echoed with the crack of their long rifles, the shouts of men engaged in desperate, close-quarters combat. While Morgan's men were locked in this vicious struggle, another fight erupted nearby. The British General No Flint Gray, ever impatient for action, decided he would not wait for Howe's signal. He led his own column, which included the elite Queen's Rangers, into a direct assault on the American center left. They crashed into a brigade of Pennsylvania militia, who after a brief fight, broke and retreated. In the confusion of the fight, Gray's advance cut off two high-ranking American officers, Colonel Joseph Reed and General John Cadwalder. A group of Hessian soldiers, seeing them, rushed forward, their bayonets leveled, ready to finish these two men. In that desperate moment, Captain Allen McLean and his squadron of cavalry appeared as if from nowhere. With a shout, McLean ordered an immediate charge. The American horsemen thundered into the Hessians, scattering them in a panic, saving those two officers from certain death. The fighting on Edge Hill raged for hours. Morgan's riflemen were eventually forced to pull back by the sheer weight of the British numbers. But they'd done their job magnificently. They had mauled the British advance, inflicting serious casualties, and brilliantly stalled Howe's flanking maneuver. General Gray, believing he was facing a much larger force and having taken some casualties himself, broke off his attack and withdrew. The American line had been tested. It had bent, but it had not broken. That night, a frustrated Sir William Howe held a final council of war with his generals. Their situation was clear. The surprise attack had been foiled. His probe of the American right on the first day had been easily repulsed. His major effort to turn the American left had been stopped cold by Morgan's riflemen. The American center remained a formidable, untouchable fortress. To order a full-scale assault now, against an alerted and prepared enemy in such a strong position would be to invite a massacre of the scale of Bunker Hill or worse. Howe's attack had failed. The soft comforts of winter quarters in Philadelphia now beckoned for him. So, in the early hours of December 8th, the great British Army turned its back on the American camp. They began the long, dispirited march back to the city. Washington, in a final act of defiance, sent McLean's cavalry and units of light infantry to nip at their heels, harassing the rear guard, and turning the withdrawal into a disgraceful and shameful retreat. Battle of White Marsh was over. Washington had not fought the great battle Howe had envisioned. Instead, by refusing to fight on his enemy's terms and holding tight to his own, Washington had won a strategic victory. And when the British returned to Philadelphia, baffled and frustrated by their failure, the adjutant general summoned Lydia for questioning. Quote, "It is certain that we were betrayed," he told her, explaining that when they arrived at the American camp, they found them not sleeping, but, quote, "so prepared at every point to receive us that we have been compelled to march back, like a parcel of fools." Lydia, with remarkable composure, insisted her family had been asleep the entire night. The mystified officer let the matter drop. The quiet Quaker midwife had outwitted the British Army. The 3 days of fighting around White Marsh had been sharp, bloody, but the final casualty count was not catastrophic for either army. The Americans suffered approximately 150 killed, wounded, or captured. The combined British and Hessian forces lost around 100 men. But the most telling statistic of the campaign was not written in blood, but by the muster of the army's rolls. In the days following the return to Philadelphia, nearly 240 of Howe's soldiers deserted. A staggering number, more than double the British Army's combat losses. It was a clear, undeniable sign of collapsing morale. The British held the enemy's capital, but they had failed to win the war, and their commander seemed incapable of landing a final decisive blow. The outcome of the battle itself was viewed differently by the two commanders. Washington wrote to Congress expressing his disappointment that the British had not launched a full-scale assault. He was confident that from the strength of his camp, the result would have been a fortunate and happy victory for the American cause. Howe, in his official report to London, was forced to publicly admit his failure. He justified his withdrawal by stating that the American position was, quote, "too well secured both by labor and nature to make an attack advisable." For Howe, this inconclusive end to the Philadelphia campaign was the final mark against his leadership. Yes, he had captured the capital, but he had failed to destroy the Continental Army. As such, he would soon be recalled to England in disgrace. So, the Battle of White Marsh was a critical victory for Washington in the American Revolution. Yet the engagement also made it painfully clear that White Marsh was not really a suitable place for the army to spend the winter. It was too close to Philadelphia, leaving it vulnerable to another British attack. On top of that, the weeks of occupation by two large armies had stripped the surrounding countryside of food, firewood, and the forage for animals. A new winter encampment had to be found. On December 11th, just 3 days after Howe's army disappeared back to Philadelphia, Washington gave an order to break camp. After much debate among his generals, a new location was chosen, a place called Valley Forge. It was a naturally defensible plateau, far from the British, and strategically positioned to protect the Army's supply lines and the temporary American capital at York. The Continental Army had survived the Philadelphia campaign. They'd faced the best the British Empire could throw at them and had not been broken. They were not a defeated army retreating into winter, but a tested army redeploying for the next phase of the war. The battle was over, but the winter that would forge them into a professional fighting force was just beginning. I hope you enjoyed this look at the Battle of White Marsh. Let me know any of your thoughts in the comments below. And if you found this video interesting or learned something new, please consider hitting the like button and subscribe to my channel for more History Distilled episodes. Again, thanks for watching, and as always, have a great day if you want to.